Hey everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Politically Incorrect Podcast. I'm Jim Williams. Joining me, as always, my partner in crime, Alan J. Steinberg. This is a special one, and it is a memorial to George Herbert Walker Bush, and in general to the Bush family. And Alan, of course, will lead off with you. You worked very closely with the Bush family, and I know this is something that's near and dear to your heart. I'll let you start off.
Thank you very much, Jim. I spent a lot of this week in tears about the Bush family. Not that it was a tragedy, because he lived a very good long life, George Herbert Walker Bush, passing away at the age of 94. But it marks the end of an era in two significant ways. Number one, he was a great man of the greatest generation. And as such, the heroism, the physical heroism he displayed in World War II when his plane was shot down, when he managed somehow to survive, and he had volunteered for the most life-threatening assignment in spite of the fact that as a child of privilege he could have avoided it. This marked him as a man of unbelievable personal courage and also patriotism, which is why when I used to hear people describe him as a wimp, I used to feel like slugging somebody. It was the most defamatory, insulting reference you could have given George Herbert Walker Bush. The other thing is that it's a end of an era of profound decency. I thought it was so moving to see sitting next to each other the members of the President's Club, people like Barack Obama and Michelle, Bill Clinton and Hillary, and above all, George W. Bush and Laura, and the atmosphere of genuine friendship, having served in this position. And Jimmy Carter was there also. They brought dignity to the White House. I have to make a quick observation. You could see sort of a chill between Hillary Clinton and Jimmy Carter. I don't know what that was about. But it's still, even with that, it was a sign of great mutual respect. And all that is lost in this era of Donald Trump. When I saw him throw his coat at the soldier like he was a bathroom attendant, it was offensive. But unfortunately, I got up Friday with the reality that Donald Trump is still the president of the United States, and the era of slander and defamation is still going full boat, and the era of magnificent civility, symbolized by these 4 or 5 presidents, unfortunately is over. And it was a very sad thing and difficult thing for me to take.
Well, one of the things that, look, none of those men sitting there were saints. We know that.
No,
they all had their faults. George Herbert Walker had his faults, but at the end of the day, you could disagree without being disrespectful,
disagreeable. Yeah,
right. And I think that what happened during that entire morning of speeches were, one was almost better than the other as they continued throughout the service, and I think that what people were trying to point, and why George Herbert Walker Bush was so revered, was that he realized that you don't have to agree with somebody, but you do have to respect them. And I think that's what the Bush family was all about, was they understood that people didn't agree with them, but at the other point in time, they went out of their way to respect them.
You know what is so significant about what you just said is I had an experience with each of the presidential Bushes that really signified that. In the case of Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, in 1980, he was running for the Republican nomination against Ronald Reagan. Now, I had strong relationships with both the Reagan camp and the Bush camp, but I was invited by Eugene McCaffrey, who was the former surrogate of Gloucester County, New Jersey, a really great man, and served in Tom Kaine's cabinet. He was the campaign manager for George Herbert Walker Bush in New Jersey. He called me up and he invited me to a meeting with him, with Bush 41, and with 5 other people, and Gene took care of me. I arrived at the meeting. I was seated right next to George Herbert Walker Bush.
Mm-hmm.
So he went around the room and he asked how we felt his campaign was being received. And I said to him, well, there is one way where you're not connecting, and that is you have one of the greatest resumes, maybe the greatest resume of any presidential candidate I've ever seen. He was a great foreign policy president because he had all the requisite experience.
Mm-hmm.
He had been the director of the CIA. He had been the head of the liaison office in Peking. He had been ambassador to the United Nations. And I said, you're not getting that message out. And I ended with that. And he kept coming back to me. He kept saying, well, I want to talk about what this gentleman over here said. And I was thrilled. I was delighted that I was being shown such respect, that he wasn't speaking down to me, that he felt that what I and the others in the room said was of interest and value. He made you feel as if you were important to him. Now, the same thing was true of Bush 43. The greatest thing you could say to Bush 43 was God bless you. And he was a man of sincere religious beliefs, and he took that as the finest thing you could do for him. But when we would have meetings with him, at my level of EPA, I was in the sub-cabinet of the president. He really was interested in what was being said, what we thought. And this was remarkable because other presidents have often not been that way. They're more interested in talking to you rather than hearing from you. Mm-hmm. And that was a great thing about Bush 41, Bush 43. They viewed themselves as having conversations with the American people and not lecturing them. That's an ultimate tribute to them.
Yeah, the other thing with Bush 41 was, and the people don't give him a lot of credit for, was as you said, the foreign policy aspect of it. Angela Merkel talking about the fact that he, for all intents and purposes, was one of the founding fathers of the New Germany. And
yes, he was.
Where Reagan kind of took it, took the breaking of the Cold War to say the 50-yard line, it was up to George Herbert Walker Bush to take it into the end zone. And again, I don't know that he gets enough credit for that one.
I don't think he does. I don't think the Bushes get enough credit. Well, I'm talking about primarily Bush 41. Bush 43 did some very good things regarding India, regarding our relationship with Israel, regarding our relationships with Africa in the fight against AIDS. Unfortunately, what happened in Iraq will hinder his relationship in history. I have to concede that. But by and large, there were good things he did that I don't think the media gave him sufficient credit. As for Bush 41, his rating when he first left office was hampered by the recession of 1991, which really was anyone gets blamed for a recession happens on their watch. That's politics. Mm-hmm. But what few people at the time took into account was that was a recession that resulted from the fact that Iraq had conquered Kuwait, and that they were now controlling about 60% of the oil in the world, and they were arbitrarily increasing prices, which was leading to business slowdowns in the United States and countries throughout the world. That was an oil price caused recession, and for that reason, excuse me, I don't think that the public considered that, and they tended to blame George Herbert Walker Bush excessively for that recession. Because taking that aside, he was quite a successful president. He also enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was a long overdue recognition of the rights of not only the disabled, but the necessity of allowing us to benefit from their great works. And, that was an act that was in the interest of our nation. And also his amendments to the Clean Air Act, which did so much to deal with toxic pollutants, acid rain. I will always honor and revere the memory of George Herbert Walker Bush.
The other part of George Herbert Walker Bush in that regard was his ability to, during the Gulf War, he sent James Baker to Morocco to meet with Saddam Hussein's counterpart to James Baker. And as you recall, they told them, look, you have an opportunity. We need you to get out of Kuwait and, leave Qatar alone, and we will not, attack. And they chose not to listen to Mr. Baker. And 48 hours later, they were attacked. Bush 41 did exactly what you said before, and that, of course, is used his expertise with the UN to put together a truly universal force of countries from around the world who backed the United States in that. And if you remember in the book that was written by General Schwarzkopf, General Schwarzkopf.
Yeah, Norman Schwarzkopf.
Norman Schwarzkopf, who was running the campaign. He said that he reported to the president, we can literally walk into Baghdad and take out Saddam Hussein, to which the president said, absolutely not. Do not do that. That is not part of what we were sent here to do. What our job was to do, we have done. So we will come home. Now, that showed restraint. It showed his understanding of the world order, in that we were not there to change regime. We were there to do what the UN edict had been for that war. But it caused consternation for him among his entire cabinet, with Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld, Mr. Wolfowitz, and some of the other neocons who would come back later under 43 and not necessarily, basically get us into war.
Well, the significance of what you just said cannot be understated. John Meacham was the biographer of
Right.
George Herbert Walker Bush. He gave a magnificent eulogy. I thought it was outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
And the funniest part of that eulogy was where he talked about when he walked into a store and he shook hands with a mannequin, and they were laughing at him. He said, well, you never know. He had that kind of humility.
Right.
But, he really understood the dangers that were involved in really overdoing, our mission in Iraq. He understood the necessity for restraint. Later on, when we tried the option of regime change, that's where things went wrong. But he had all these magnificent skills. He had the ability to take everything into account, but ultimately make the final decision himself. He never made a decision where he didn't listen to others. The only time he did, there was one time he did, and it didn't work out for him so well, is when he selected Dan Quayle as his vice presidential running mate. Now, I like Quayle, and I think he's underrated, and I think he could have been a decent president. But politically, the choice of Quayle was a disaster. And he said, that one I did on my own. So that one he probably should have listened a little more. And but he didn't let anyone know what he was thinking. And I think he learned from that.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, we will be back with more of the Politically Incorrect podcast after these words from BMW.
Life is about making decisions. At BMW I, we decided it was time to reinvent the car from the ground up, making sure we were open for truly innovative ideas. We decided that the car we wanted must be electric, and it should be made of extremely light and super strong carbon fiber. And finally, we decided to make it more intelligent and added our promise of incomparable driving pleasure. We made all these decisions to offer you a choice. The all-electric BMW i3.
Welcome back to the Politically Incorrect podcast. I'm Jim Williams, here with Alan J. Steinberg, as we sit around and listen to and talk about the life and times of George Herbert Walker Bush and the Bush family in general. Alan, one of the interesting things, we just talked a little bit about the Gulf War, was that when George W. Bush, who you worked for, it took over as president. President Bush wasn't, in Meacham's book, as a matter of fact, he wasn't necessarily kind to Cheney and to Rumsfeld for what
100% right.
He felt they had taken advantage of his son in that particular instance. Perhaps you can enlighten us on that one.
Absolutely. A very salient point you make, Jim. Because George Herbert Walker Bush was a devotee of the school of political foreign policy realism, and doing what was in our self-interest, but not get carried away with the goals of a moral crusader. And so his foreign policy style basically served us very well. He listened to people like James Baker and Brent Scowcroft. I didn't always agree with them on certain issues, Israel being one of them, but by and large, their guidance on foreign policy was very helpful and very prudent. Whereas Bush 43 fell under the influence of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who gave him very bad advice. And presidents are basically a product often in terms of who their advisors are. And Bush 43 did not have the sage advisors that Bush 41 had. And Bush 41 knew this, but he didn't want to, not only would he be criticizing his own son, he refrained from criticizing any of his successors, which I think was smart because he was able to befriend them later on. He and Bill Clinton formed a remarkable friendship, so much so that people observed that George Bush 41 was almost a surrogate father to Bill Clinton. And the Bush sons, George W., Jeb, Neil Marvin, they used to say, well, Bill Clinton is our brother from a different mother. It was a wonderful thing to see that kind of friendship. You're not going to get that kind of friendship with Donald Trump with anybody.
No, and the funny thing that Barbara Bush, who, if you're ever lucky enough to be around her, you could clearly see that she was the woman in charge of the entire family, including both presidents. But Mrs. Bush famously told Jeb in 2015, as he was deciding to run for president, and knew that Hillary Clinton would be running against him, told him, "Okay, fine, but you played nice with your sister." And I thought that was kind of a funny line from her. Be nice to your sister.
I think it was a funny and accurate line.
Yeah, pretty close. My relationship with both presidents actually came from the love of baseball. I first met the vice president then, George Bush, at an Astros game, and I used to be involved directing and producing Astros baseball in Houston. And we would actually offer him an opportunity to please come by the booth, and he would occasionally do it. And when he had the time to come to the games, and would sit down and chat with our broadcast team, and then do something that very few people did, and that would be come by the truck and say hello to the crew and talk about how much he enjoyed watching the games when he was in D.C. or wherever he might be around the country. So he was quite very polite about that. On the other part of George W. Bush, that was when, of course, he was the owner of the Texas Rangers, and we were in Dallas and finished our negotiation for the rights fee. And my boss at the time, Jack Stanfield, said to him, well, Mr. Bush, are you going to follow your father's footsteps and get into politics, or what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm either going to run for governor or become the commissioner of baseball. And, on the day that he was elected president of the United States, Stanfield gave me a call and said, I wonder if he would like to trade that to become the commissioner of baseball. And it's a little easier being commissioner of baseball than it is to be president of the United States. But no, I disagreed on many situations with both the presidents, but I always respected them all, and even had a good relationship with Jeb, who is also, just like his brother, a guy with a great sense of humor, able to laugh at himself, and able to be very, very easy to get along with.
100%. And we will not see the likes of such a father-son combination again, in my view. So we mourn their passing, but we're grateful that America was served by two such outstanding gentlemen.
Absolutely. There's one other quick thing, which I think was interesting. You talked about John Meacham doing the eulogy. Chris Matthews, my former boss and someone who I get a kick out of from time to time, had a funny statement, which really was very much an inside baseball thing. You'll get a kick out of this. We both do a lot of public speaking, and both of us have written speeches for other people. Following Meacham, after that speech he made, after the eulogy he had to be a difficult thing. But I will say this. One thing I want to say to those of you who don't know what's going on here, very pleased and very enjoyed hearing and seeing again Alan Simpson, a guy with an incredibly amazing wit and tremendous ability to speak. Alan Simpson's a treat.
And I'll tell you something. His remark, which I have committed to memory, and one of the all-time great comments, was when he said that in Washington, D.C., those who are truly humble are not bothered by excessive traffic. How true that is. That was a sage observation.
It definitely was, and it's something that we will remember, as we will remember, of course, the life and times of George Herbert Walker Bush. And
absolutely.
Let's wrap it up with Alan. You can, if you would be so kind, give us your social media, how people can find you. And you wrote a wonderful column. Make sure that you tell them how to find that column you wrote about.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim. My column is called "My New Jersey Memories of George Herbert Walker Bush." It's on the website insidernj.com, where I am a regular contributing columnist. And I also write columns. I didn't write one on the Bushes. I also write a column once a month for NewJerseyAdvance.com, which is the NJ.com, I should say, which is the website on which the Newark Star Ledger, New Jersey's leading newspaper, is published. My Facebook page is Alan, A-L-A-N, Joel, J-O-E-L, Steinberg. My email is asteinberg613@gmail.com. My Twitter handle is @asteinberg613. And I often write on News Talk Florida as well. So you can look me up on Google. You'll find me. I'm always available for comment and good feedback from you.
And hopefully, if you're not one of the over 50,000 people who already subscribe to the podcast, you will go out to the Apple Podcast Store, Google Play. You can find us at Spreaker, Stitcher. You can find us at iHeartRadio, as well as TuneIn, YouTube, and many other places. All you have to do is search the Politically Incorrect Podcast with Jim Williams and Alan Steinberg, and you will be able to subscribe. So please go out and do that for us today. We would greatly appreciate it. We close this week's Politically Incorrect Podcast with a eulogy delivered at George Herbert Walker Bush's funeral by John Meacham.
The story was almost over even before it had fully begun. Shortly after dawn on Saturday, September 2nd, 1944, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Herbert Walker Bush, joined by two crewmates, took off from the USS San Jacinto to attack a radio tower on Chichijima. As they approached the target, the air was heavy with flak. The plane was hit. Smoke filled the cockpit. Flames raced across the wings. My God, Lieutenant Bush thought, this thing's gonna go down. Yet he kept the plane in its 35-degree dive, dropped his bombs, and then roared off out to sea, telling his crewmates to hit the silk. Following protocol, Lieutenant Bush turned the plane so they could bail out. Only then did Bush parachute from the cockpit. The wind propelled him backward, and he gashed his head on the tail of the plane as he flew through the sky. He plunged deep into the ocean, bobbed to the surface, and flopped onto a tiny raft. His head bleeding, his eyes burning, his mouth and throat raw from salt water. The future 41st President of the United States was alone. Sensing that his men had not made it, he was overcome. He felt the weight of responsibility as a nearly physical burden, and he wept. Then, at 4 minutes shy of noon, a submarine emerged to rescue the downed pilot. George Herbert Walker Bush was safe. The story, his story and ours, would go on by God's grace. Through the ensuing decades, President Bush would frequently ask, nearly daily, he'd ask himself, why me? Why was I spared? And in a sense, the rest of his life was a perennial effort to prove himself worthy of his salvation on that distant morning. To him, his life was no longer his own. There were always more missions to undertake, more lives to touch, and more love to give. And what a headlong race he made of it all. He never slowed down. On the primary campaign trail in New Hampshire once, he grabbed the hand of a department store mannequin asking for votes. When he realized his mistake, he said, "Never know, gotta ask." You can hear the voice, can't you? As Dana Carvey said, the key to a Bush 41 impersonation is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. George Herbert Walker Bush was America's last great soldier statesman, a 20th century founding father. He governed with virtues that most closely resemble those of Washington and of Adams, of TR and of FDR, of Truman and of Eisenhower, of men who believed in causes larger than themselves. 6'2", handsome, dominant in person, President Bush spoke with those big, strong hands, making fists to underscore points. A master of what Franklin Roosevelt called the science of human relationships. He believed that to whom much was given, much is expected. And because life gave him so much, he gave back again and again and again. He stood in the breach in the Cold War against totalitarianism. He stood in the breach in Washington against unthinking partisanship. He stood in the breach against tyranny and discrimination. And on his watch, a wall fell in Berlin. A dictator's aggression did not stand. And doors across America opened to those with disabilities. And in his personal life, he stood in the breach against heartbreak and hurt, always offering an outstretched hand, a warm word, a sympathetic tear. If you were down, he would rush to lift you up. And if you were soaring, he would rush to savor your success. Strong and gracious, comforting and charming, loving and loyal, he was our shield in danger's hour. Now, of course, there was ambition, too, loads of that. To serve, he had to succeed. To preside, he had to prevail. Politics, he once admitted, isn't a pure undertaking. Not if you want to win, it's not. An imperfect man, he left us a more perfect union. It must be said that for a keenly intelligent statesman of stirring, almost unparalleled private eloquence, public speaking was not exactly a strong suit. Fluency in English, President Bush once remarked, is something that I'm often not accused of. Looking ahead to the '88 election, he observed, inarguably, it's no exaggeration to say that the undecideds could go one way or the other. And late in his presidency, he allowed that we're enjoying sluggish times, but we're not enjoying them very much. His tongue may have run amok at moments, but his heart was steadfast. His life code, as he said, was tell the truth, don't blame people, be strong, do your best, try hard, forgive, stay the course. And that was and is the most American of creeds. Abraham Lincoln's better angels of our nature and George H.W. Bush's 1,000 points of light are companion verses in America's national hymn. For Lincoln and Bush both called on us to choose the right over the convenient, to hope rather than to fear, and to heed not our worst impulses, but our best instincts. In this work, he had the most wonderful of allies in Barbara Pierce Bush, his wife of 73 years. He called her Bar, the Silver Fox, and, when the situation warranted, the Enforcer. He was the only boy she ever kissed. Her children, Mrs. Bush liked to say, always wanted to throw up when they heard that. In a letter to Barbara during the war, young George H.W. Bush had written, I love you, precious, with all my heart, and to know that you love me means my life. How lucky our children will be to have a mother like you. And as they will tell you, they surely were. As vice president, Bush once visited a children's leukemia ward in Krakow. 35 years before, he and Barbara had lost a daughter, Robin, to the disease. In Krakow, a small boy wanted to greet the American vice president. Learning that the child was sick with the cancer that had taken Robin, Bush began to cry. To his diary later that day, the vice president said this, my eyes flooded with tears, and behind me was a bank of television cameras, and I thought, I can't turn around. I can't dissolve because of personal tragedy in the face of the nurses that give of themselves every day. So I stood there looking at this little guy, tears running down my cheek, hoping he wouldn't see, but if he did, hoping he'd feel that I loved him. That was the real George H.W. Bush, a loving man with a big, vibrant, all-enveloping heart. And so we ask, as we commend his soul to God, and as he did, why him? Why was he spared? The workings of providence are mysterious, but this much is clear. The George Herbert Walker Bush, who survived that fiery fall into the waters of the Pacific 3/4 of a century ago, made our lives and the lives of nations freer, better, warmer, and nobler. That was his mission. That was his heartbeat. And if we listen closely enough, we can hear that heartbeat even now. For it's the heartbeat of a lion who not only led us, but who loved us. That's why him. That's why he was spared.